and welcome to Selling Power TV. Today we have a special guest, Charles Jacobs, and his claim to fame is he is probably the best storyteller in the United States that is helping salespeople perform better and humanize the sales process through stories. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Gerhard. And that was a wonderful introduction. But what's this probably the best?
Well, thank you. Um, what I wanted to know is you have been in sales for a long time. At what point did you discover that of all the sales processes and all the conversations that you can have with a client, why a story is so much more effective?
That's a great question. And I should say that I've been in sales now for about 55 years. I started selling women's shoes when I was 16 years old. And if you talk about good sales training, it was the best I ever had.
Really?
But as I sort of evolved in my career, I decided that I wanted to be a psychiatrist, became fascinated by the mind and the way the mind worked. And then I had the opportunity to work in a mental hospital, and I realized that nothing I was studying in college had anything to do with the reality of what I was seeing in that mental hospital. And I just, by a matter of, it was just an accident. I was reading a book, and the book was about a guy who ends up working in a mental hospital, loves it so much, at the end of the book, he checks in and becomes one of the patients. And I'm thinking, my God, this story works so well. I really understood the experience of my patients in a way I never had before. There's something about stories. So believe it or not, I shifted. I decided I was going to be a literary critic. And that's all my graduate work was, studying that. And I was always fascinated by stories, but at some point I realized I can't make a living doing this. Why don't I go into management consulting? And I ended up doing that. And I started using stories in any way I possibly could. But Gerhard, I never really understood why they were so powerful until about 20 years ago. I read an article about telling stories in law. And there was a little line in the article which was, because stories are the way the mind
Right.
works. And I'd never thought about it. That was the missing piece that I hadn't had. We don't process our experience logically. We process it through a story. So the first thing is, when we tell a story to people, we're speaking the language that their brain responds to.
Yep.
And little by little, I started to understand that even in the work I do, I run workshops, that even in the work I do, I wasn't telling stories, I was lecturing. And I, at some point, said, well, I got to start practicing what I preach. And I started to use stories. And when I used stories, the audience changed. I'd present and they kind of drifting off, looking at their phones. I'd tell a story. Everybody was riveted on what I was saying. So that really keyed me into it. And then as I started applying this and working with large companies with large sales forces, they kept telling me it was the most wonderful thing they'd ever been through. Stories were just so powerful. So that was my realization, that stories had this tremendous power. And I actually think that storytelling is the transformative technology of the 21st century. It's not AI, it's not ChatGPT. It's the ability to tell that story compellingly because it's the language the brain speaks.
Yeah. It's fascinating. When, I've been running the Sales 3.0 conference for over 15 years. And when I look at the speaker ratings, the speakers that get the highest ratings always tell great stories. Case in point, 2 weeks ago, we were in Las Vegas, and there was one presenter who put on, before he went on stage, a chef's hat and told a story about how a chef creates magic with a lot of different ingredients, but what makes it really a great chef is the the secret sauce, which is orchestrating everything and create an experience that's extraordinary. And that's what we are aiming to do with stories in a sales conversation, elevate that from a transaction to a relationship that is elevated through the art of storytelling.
I'm not going to give away our ages, Gerhard, but you and I have been in this business a long time.
Right.
And when I first got into selling, I read all the classic books. I read Napoleon Hill, I read Dale Carnegie, I read Zig Ziglar, and I kept looking for these techniques. And I realized that virtually all of those classics were not about techniques. They were about your confidence, how you felt about yourself, and how you built human
Right.
relationships. So, there's a line in our business, every sale is a relationship sale. I absolutely believe that. If you can connect with people as human beings, it's pretty hard to dismiss you. And that's really what stories are so great at
And
doing.
there's such a tension right now in the environment we live in. Um, we love technology because it gives us the illusion of progressing. Whenever a company rolls out a new technology, people get excited, and once they look under the hood, then they start to worry: is it safe? Do we have to learn new things? What if we give up the existing software to improve our sales force? What are we losing? What's the risk of salespeople not adopting the new technology? So there's a tension between technology and humanity, and I think stories bring us back to the basics, because Sam Keen, the screenwriter, said stories are equipment for living.
That's a wonderful quote. That's just a wonderful quote. Um, I work with this little organization up in Seattle, and they throw a big conference in Las Vegas every year. And their chief technical officer gets up and gives a keynote address. And the keynote address is, first of all, he's German, pardon me, but you have very heavy German accent. And he speaks for 3 hours about technology. And so they're telling me this. And I said, so what kind of, people sit for 3 hours and listen to technology? And they said, yeah, they do. And I said, well, what are the evaluations of the participants? Oh, he gets terrible evaluations. Has anybody ever told him? Oh, no, 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 we couldn't possibly tell him. So every year, this guy gets up and does technology. And that company hired us to teach their salespeople to stop selling on speeds and feeds and start telling stories.
Right.
And once you start telling stories, you can hang the technology off of it,
Right.
but you're making that connection with people. Plus, we love stories, so we pay attention. You got to imagine that 3 hours in, you're beginning to think about other things, and you're not
Yeah.
listening to what the person is saying anymore.
And there's a certain amount of suspense when you tell a story. I remember going before the internet, to the Library of Congress to figure out how can I grow selling power. And I looked at a magazine from um, 1897, and it was called How to Sell. And that magazine was the leading sales magazine until the Great Depression. And they had interviews, stories from Madame Curie, from Walter Chrysler, from David Rockefeller, and they had interviews with those people. And I thought, what a great idea! So I started to take that idea, and I thought, I'm going to tell stories in Selling Power magazine about the leaders of our times, like Mark Benioff, who started Salesforce.com, or Michael Dell, or Mary Kay Ash and Zig Ziglar, and Ed McMahon and Jay Leno. People want to know, you know, how do you design a life that's a storied life, that is remarkable, that people want to talk about?
You know, I, I'm sorry you couldn't get a Rockefeller and you ended up with me for this interview. But one of the things that I learned in the process of working with sales forces was, telling a story is really great. I mean, the story gets you emotionally. It does have suspense in it, so it holds your attention. You're not telling people things, you're showing people. And I thought, this is really powerful. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that stories are the way that we define everything in our life.
Right.
And stories are the way that we define ourselves.
Yeah.
So going back to what I said about Zig Ziglar earlier on in Napoleon, what ends up happening in these workshops is people learn to tell their story. Not
Exactly.
necessarily the
Yeah.
story they have been told they have to have by their parents or their bosses, but they look. And once they do that, they come across with tremendous confidence and tremendous power. And so I think that's what makes somebody really great is when you've got a story that's compelling, you've got confidence in yourself, and you're communicating with people, not telling them stuff, but showing them, helping them feel it.
It's fascinating. It reminds me of an article that was crafted by Dr. Donald Moore, who is a great sales psychologist, and he said about stories that uh, we are trained, from early on. We wanted our parents to read us a story, and in stories, when you tell a story, it almost transforms the listener into that child state where they want to know, how does it end? And uh, and there is one brilliant mind, David Schwartz, who did this Goldwater commercial. Remember that in the 50s,
Mm-hmm.
where there's this little girl, she loves me not, and then it's about the atomic explosion, and it's designed to create fear in the public. And he created the term partipulation, which is everything in a conversation is partially designed to manipulate, to get your way, to get the upper hand. But if you do it with the participation of somebody else, then you can persuade, and then you achieve conversation mastery.
That's really interesting. The issue of manipulation often will come up in a workshop
Yeah,
where you'll be teaching people influence and say, well, isn't that manipulative? Well, the reality is that's who we are as human
yeah.
beings. The most important thing as a human being, because we're a social species, is to get people to support us. We find that people that can build collaboration obviously are more successful in every aspect of life. So once you get that ability to connect with people and to tell that story, you've really got people on their side, on your side. But I just want to go back for a moment because I guess where I really learned about stories was when I was raising my two daughters, and I could say, "Look, you're not supposed to do that. You're going to hurt yourself."
Right.
And their eyes would glaze over. And then I would say to them, I learned to say to them, our great Aunt Bessie once did exactly what you're doing. And as a result, she could never play the piano again. And her career was over. And my kids would just be riveted on these stories. I think they were 16 and 17 before they asked me, we really don't have an Aunt Bessie, do we? But what happens to people, you just see it in their eyes. They just immediately go for that story.
I think another idea that we need to mention to our audience, and think about it. It's not just you that tells a story. You want to discover the customer story, and you want to encourage the customer to tell you a story of the troubles they have experienced, about the problem they're trying to solve. There's always a story behind it, and if you uncover that story, you can use it as a sales tool.
Yeah, and I might go even a little bit further with that. They're telling a story, and they're probably telling a story about you as
Yeah.
well. And unfortunately, salespeople don't necessarily get the best stories told about themselves. But and your goal as a salesperson is, pardon me for this line, control the narrative. Do what you need to do to get them telling a different story about you, the story that you want them to be telling. And the other thing that we should really mention is there are stories and there are
Yeah.
stories. Some stories are no good. Some stories are good. And one of the things you begin to learn as a salesperson now, what are the stories that really work for people? What's really resonating? And once you land on that, you keep using it.
So give me one sort of story that you like to use when you sell your story selling sales training.
Wow. Okay. I at one point was an academic. I used to teach, and I was living in this small New England village, and I was teaching at a liberal arts school, a very undistinguished liberal arts school. And when I was living in that town, developers came in and they wanted to build a ski area and build condominiums. Well, this town hadn't changed much in about 250 years. So about half the town said, no, we don't want that. It's going to ruin the quality of life. The other half said, yeah, we want that because of the economic benefit. So we held a town hall meeting where everybody could speak their piece and we could vote on whether we were going to allow this to happen. So the developers presented, and they'd obviously been in this situation before, Gerhard, and they were just polished and brilliant, and almost anticipated every objection and had a way around it. And when they sat down, everybody in the room thought they had won. But after a couple of moments, a little old man stood up in the back of the room, and he said, you do seem like nice people to me, and I don't understand all these numbers, but what you're saying reminds me of a friend of mine who's always got to have a pickle for lunch. Sandwiches is lunch, but he needs a pickle to have a complete meal. So he eats bite of the sandwich, bite of the pickle. When he finishes both, he's completely satisfied. The little old man pauses for a moment, looks back up at the developers and says, you're asking for one hell of a big pickle. Well, the room's completely quiet because nobody knows what this guy is talking about. And all of this sudden, there's a little bit of laughter, and the laughter builds and builds and builds as people get the point. Well, look, a pickle's kind of a silly food. So, that's going to get people to laugh anyway. Also, to compare a pickle to, compare a multi-million-dollar development to pickles, a little bit silly as well. But the other thing is pickle means in English, a difficult situation.
Yep.
And people got that. And so for the rest of the day, all they did was talk about the proposed development as one hell of a big pickle. At the end of the day, a vote was taken and the developer's request was denied. Think about what just happened. A stupid story, not at all related to the subject that we were discussing, changed that many people's minds. That's the power of a story.
It's amazing. I could talk with you for hours. We only had 15 minutes, but what I'd like the audience to know is you have a fantastic program. Give us the URL that people should go to learn more about you.
Sure. Our website is arcinnovation.com. And there's a lot of things on stories that you'll pick up. Like the first story that we have a record of is 45,000 years old. That's how long they've been around. So we'd love to talk to people. We don't necessarily need to sell you anything. We'd just love to share with you what we've learned about stories and perhaps how you can use them as well.
It's really interesting that how do you date a story back 45,000 years?
Because this one is visual and it's on the wall of a cave in France. And it is a story told about a pig. I mean, I don't know why. But the one thing that we have found, there's a lot of research on this, the stories clearly predate sort of straight logic or reason or legal systems or whatever. We call them myths. And they were the way that we guided behavior before we had lawyers, I guess, and politicians. And so that's why it's so easy for us to tap into that storytelling, because it's just who we are.
Well, as a thank you for listening, I want to invite people to join our Sales 3.0 conference. It's the AI Sales Summit of 2023. It's in December. And anybody who signs up is going to be delighted, because this is the story about how technology is going to make sales easier. And you're going to learn a lot of interesting things on how to reduce the complexity of sales. And the reason we had this conversation is to remind everybody it's about humanity, not about technology. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you for having me on, Gerhard.